Hi, and welcome to everyone listening or viewing this podcast, or shall I say, vodcast, webinar, or whatever the right name is. My name is Aram Hovsepian, and I will be the host. And aside from my daily job running a product company called Codific, I also fight cybercrime at night by being one of OWASP SAMM core team members. OWASP SAMM, which stands for Software Assurance Maturity Model, is the industry standard framework that helps organizations assess their current security posture and improve in an iterative and risk-driven manner. And in this podcast, we will focus on the assessment part of SAMM. SAMM assessment is, in general, the process that eventually leads to determining the SAMM score of team, organization, or whatever you pick as a scope. And once you know what your current security posture is, you can then go ahead and plan an improvement roadmap. Now, it turns out that doing the SAMM assessments, which gives an objective SAMM score, is not that obvious. And that's why I have invited 3 AppSec veterans with thousands of hours of SAMM assessment experience to give their opinion, tips and tricks, best practices in doing the perfect SAMM assessment or a great SAMM assessment in order to start the improvement journey. Now, I would like to welcome Brian Glass, Maxime Bale, and Rob van der Veer. Thank you very much for joining this. Please introduce yourselves and definitely try to mention why you love OWASP SAMM. And I would do it alphabetically by starting with Brian first.
Thanks, Aram. I'm Brian Glass. So I have been working in application security for, close to 18 years now or so, somewhere in that range. I've been working with OWASP SAMM for almost a decade now. Been part of the core team, multiple versions. I've lost track of how many different SAMM assessments I've conducted, from very large organizations to very small organizations. SAMM is amazing because it's one of the very few prescriptive models out there, especially related to secure software development. There are a few others like Microsoft SDL, which are interesting, but it was essentially how Microsoft wrote Windows, the operating system. And so it kind of applies, but not near the same level of detail that SAMM has. And so I enjoy walking people through SAMM because it's essentially a training and learning experience when we go through it. Before I forget, my day job is essentially I am a professor and chair of the computer science department at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. So that's my day job. And I also work on a number of OWASP projects like OWASP SAMM.
Thanks, Brian. Maxime, you're next.
So I'm Maxime Bale. I'm a principal security consultant focusing on product security at Torion. I actually have a background in Linux system engineering and automation, and I rolled into SAMM because I was looking for a way to help an organization where I was working at the time implement a security development lifecycle. And I think Brian already mentioned it. The great thing about SAMM is that it's prescriptive, and at the time, I really needed detailed advice on how to do this. And for me, it was a huge learning experience using the framework, using that the company at the time, and then really making impact. It led eventually to me becoming a core team member a few years later. So I've been a core team member of SAMM now for a little bit over 3 years. Helping with Brian on the benchmark, helping with mappings to other standards, and helping to evolve the standard.
Thanks, Maxime. Rob.
Yes, thanks. So my name is Rob van der Veer, or Rob van der Veer. I work for a software improvement group for 12 years now. We help clients to create good software, secure software, which means that we're measuring the quality of their software, but we're also helping them to shift left. And as you all may know, that can be a big change for a company where they need some guidance, and that's where we use SAMM for. Before I was with SIG, I was in the software industry as a programmer, as a CEO, as a data scientist, a hacker. So together with this consultancy period at SIG, it's about 32 years of experience coming from the AI industry. And AI was really uncool back in the day, but now everybody's talking about it. So it's quite a busy period of my professional life, I have to say, which involves also doing stuff for AI at OWASP, meaning initiating the OWASP AI exchange, working together with the LLM top 10 and the machine learning top 10, working with many organizations, ISO, IEC, Sensenelec, from OWASP, which is great, working on AI security for the European AI Act, for example. It's really cool to be in the middle of that. At OWASP, I also co-created OpenCRE, opencre.org, which is sort of a platform that integrates all security standards into one resource, including SAMM, of course. And regarding SAMM, I'm not part of the core team, but I really like to contribute. A couple of years ago, I contributed the agile guidance for SAMM, which sort of takes away all the objections that people fond of agile, and there's many of them, and I'm one of them, sometimes have, because they say, well, you talk about stages, but in agile, we don't have stages. And we want to see this circle in your diagrams. So I helped explain that, yes, SAMM perfectly fits into agile, and this is how you do it. And since then, I've contributing other things, like recently our experiences with doing assessments at clients. We love to do that. We also love to teach clients how to do it to some extent, and I look forward to sharing our thoughts and experience in this group today.
To be fair,
Awesome.
Rob, I think you can be called an honorary member of the core team by now.
Yeah, I was going to say that as well. You are
guys.
part of the core team. Okay, well, my first question is, as an organization, do I really need to invite external SAMM practitioners, or I can also run assessments with my internal team of experts, assuming that naturally there is one? So what are the pros and cons, I would say, of doing external versus internal SAMM assessment? Let's start with Rob, because you went last in the previous round.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I do have some experience with this. Self-assessments are, of course, easy to organize and quick. You don't have to arrange budget. You got the people. I mean, there's SAMM, and which is open source and free. There's this whole guidance in how you can do the self-assessment. So that's great. And also, you really empower a team, a technical team, to look at how they're working, which can be sort of a positive learning effect, some introspection. So it's cheaper, quicker to arrange, fast. It has a learning effect, but it's also relatively inaccurate. Why? Well, if you talk about people in a process, about their process, and you ask them questions, they typically will answer in how they would like the process to be, or how the process is supposed to be. It requires interviewing skills, getting to the truth of things to really see how things are really going. It requires asking questions like, when was the last time you did a threat modeling? That was last year. But if you ask them, how often do you do threat modeling? With every big change, right? So the truth is sometimes hard to find when you do self-assessment. Of course, the typical self-assessor is not an expert in secure software development, so it's hard for them to assess whether, for example, a training is sufficient. Regular training, okay, how I'm going to assess that? Well, every year they watch a video of about an hour about the latest attacks. Okay, we tick the box. That's fair, because they don't have the expertise to judge whether that is sufficient or not. But it means that self-assessments will typically be more positive than if you do an external assessment. Also, because self-assessors are a little bit biased towards how they work, because they know that's how they work, and because they have sort of their pride and the reputation of themselves and their colleagues to protect. So it's almost like snitching if you're going to say that, well, our threat modeling actually is not really good. So people are biased, and that's also fair. It's just part of the game. You really cannot change that if you do a self-assessment. And last but not least, if people do a self-assessment, you cannot expect really to have any recommendations from that, other than the self-explanatory ones. We should do threat modeling every time we do a big change, but not how to do this. And an external assessor can help, setting that roadmap, and depending on the context, really pinpoint how exactly these improvements should be made.
Thanks, Rob. That was very exhaustive, I would say. So I would like to add something up to that question and move to Maxime. Maxime, taking that information into account, how about combining self-assessments with expert interviews? And how about trying to go for best of the two worlds? Because at the end of the day, the external assessor is going to need quite some time to figure out what's really, really going on. While if you could add that knowledge, that expertise, and that objectivity with, if you could team him up with someone internal who does know how things are working, but then not having him being the person who is getting assessed. So someone from another team, for instance, would that work? And what do you think about that as an idea?
Well, my recommendation would be that yes, you need to combine both. Perhaps not exactly in the way that you mentioned there. So as Rob mentioned, self-assessments are a powerful learning tool, with the biggest drawback that you indeed don't have this outside view. You're biased towards your way of working, basically in a cave, not aware of what might be happening outside of that cave, only being, let's say, informed by blog posts or what you read yourself. It's a way different as an external practitioner. So in a given month, I see several companies, and I always learn still. So as an even continuously practicing SAMM assessments, every time seeing new development life cycles and new ways of working, I keep on learning. And this expertise is extremely helpful even during assessments. As you're asking interview questions and you're putting to question some practice, I often get response like, okay, what is then the normal way of working, or what's the recommended way of working? So even during an assessment, you're already coaching a bit as an external practitioner. However, if you want to scale, if you want this initiative to scale in your company, you need to have this internal. So that this means that my recommendation would be that to, over time, build up the capacity to do internal assessments. Maybe start off with an initial assessment that you do yourself, just to get started and know the lay of the land. Then once you're ready to do a proper rollout, work with an external practitioner and make use of every bit of information that this person has in their head. And over time, slowly build up the capacity to take on internal assessments. And for me, there's a difference between self-assessment and internal assessments. So I don't believe in really doing self-assessments, but I really do believe in a central person in the organization, or a central team in the organization, doing assessments of other teams, to have at least some form of some outsider view on the processes.
Yeah, so that makes sense. So to sum up, asking one of you guys to come in, or all of you guys to come in as external help, teaching some internal team to how to do assessments, what are the details and intricacies of these assessments, and eventually give them the power to do these assessments internally. Yeah. I would like to continue to Brian if he has something to add up to these great experiences and ideas.
So it's an interesting psychological effect having a third party come in. So in my history of doing SAM assessments, one of the biggest things I've run into is that when you pay a third party to come in, the budget, the money, things are more upfront. So more time is dedicated, more space is allocated. You get time from people. So when they do internals, they don't value it as much. It becomes kind of this sunk cost. And so when you come in as an external, uh, you're more likely to get people's focused attention. They're less likely to dip out of meetings. They're more likely to pay attention when they're in the meetings because there's just this psychological effect of we're paying somebody for this time. Not that you're not paying your employees, but for whatever reason, that just doesn't seem to count. The other part is when you have a legitimate neutral third party, you are generally far more open with what's working and what's not. So this is where people will have a tendency, and sometimes it has to do with the interviewer, and like Rob mentioned, the interviewing skills. Like you want to be able to tease this out of people. You want them to feel comfortable. They want to be able to share their story with you, because most of the people I've ever talked to have frustrations, and they have frustrations about what should be working or isn't working, and they would love help to do better. They legitimately want to do better, but somebody's not listening to them. And so to them, they start to latch on to the hope that maybe this third party will produce some report that somebody in management listens to. Again, it's the psychological effect of some third party produces a report. They must be an expert, therefore we'll listen to them. And then they have this hope that things will change, things will improve. And it's been interesting in my experience that the majority of the benefit I've seen people get isn't as much a SAM score as the process itself, is the fact that we've brought people together that didn't normally take the time to sit together, to share their stories about how things work in their area, their part of the process, and then build a knowledge base, and then also build notes and experiences that we can report to their management. And it's that whole process, if you in any way can afford a SAM assessment, is invaluable. You will get a positive return on that, or you should. But like we mentioned, I mean, but as Maxim mentioned, like that's hard to scale, but it is absolutely an invaluable piece. Like it is part of the puzzle. It is not the end all be all, but it is absolutely a critical part of the puzzle, in my opinion, because you can bring that expertise in and they can help you understand where do you fit, how are you doing, how are other people responding to similar problems. And Maxim mentioned about it too. That's part of what we're trying to do with Benchmark, is we're trying to help share that knowledge so that there's more things you can learn as well from others. Because really what our whole goal is with SAM is to improve software security on the global scale. So that's what all of this work goes into.
Thanks. That was very interesting, especially the psychological aspect of it. I've never thought of that, to be honest. I would like to move on to the next, perhaps a bit less interesting topic, but it's still, for me at least, interesting to find out. How do you guys practically arrange the interview? So how many interviews do you plan? Is it a one big session of, I don't know how many hours, or you split it in several interviews? Do you have a plan that you typically try to follow? And then you could also feel free to add, like, who do you interview? So which stakeholders are you going to invite? And how many people are doing the assessment? So is it just you, or you have a buddy who helps you out taking notes? And I would like to keep it a little bit briefer because I'm going to give each and one of you the word, because I know you guys do it different way. So let's start with, again, the other way around. Let's start with Brian first, and then we'll go to Maxim and Rob.
Sounds good. So I'm gonna have to give you it depends. So it depends on who we're assessing. So I grew up learning to do SAM assessments on a massive scale where we would physically go to the company and spend 3 days of 8 to 10 hours of meetings. And we would meet with an insane number of people, but we had a view and an understanding of what was going on that was unparalleled. It was an amazing investment, and we could get all the way down the recommendations, including capital and expense recommendations. It was a crazy level of detail. That doesn't happen super often because really only very large enterprises, Fortune 100 type size companies really need or desire that detail. Typically, I'm looking at meetings, and most of them end up being remote just by the nature of things right now. I prefer in-person meetings, absolutely. Building that relationship, that trust is huge. If we do virtual meetings, I'm always on video because that's the closest I can get to being personal. If it's just a detached voice, it's really hard to trust. But typically, I don't go over 90 minutes. 60 minutes to 90 minutes. At 90 minutes, everyone's starting to wear out. It's hard to get good, solid answers. It's like a survey. After a certain number of questions, you quit trying to think about how to actually answer it correctly. Also, try to always have at least 2 people, if at all possible, as from the assessor side, because that lets you bounce, because you can't ask questions, think about what to ask next, and write accurate notes all simultaneously. And think about what was going on that you might be able to tie in that they had said at some other point. So having 2 experienced people being able to bounce back and forth asking questions is invaluable. It's also possible to do one and record the session, and you can go back. You just don't get as much out of it up front because you can't ask as probing questions. You have to do follow-up later. But generally try to roughly break it into business functions. Have a tendency to modify that a little bit. A lot of times I'll include all the architecture stuff together. So it might be some of design and a little bit of verification. And then do all of the requirements, testing, defect management together. So kind of crossing over between the functions a little bit, but typically it's about 5 meetings, approximately 90 minutes. And again, it depends on the organization. Sometimes I can get done in 3 or 4 meetings, and sometimes it takes 6. It depends how talkative they are. It depends how much variety they have, how much detail they provide. There's a lot of factors that go into it.
Thank you, Brian. Maxim, do you do things differently, same way, or what are your experiences?
I think my approach is quite
advice?
different. Yeah, I think my approach is quite different. So I have like a quite structured approach. So in general, remember as a consultant, so upfront, I try to arrange that I really have the key stakeholders all in one meeting. I start with introduction training on SAMM, given that the company often where I'm doing work, or at least the people that I'm interviewing, often didn't have a lot of exposure before. And then I do 2 to 3 3-hour meetings spread over a time period. So yes, at 90 minutes of interviews, people start to lose their edge a bit, but I basically do a choose your own adventure approach to interviews. So I know SAMM, I know the book. I wrote the choose your own adventure book, or at least I have it in the back of my head. And I'm just asking, depending on who I have with me, like, okay, I'm a new hire. How does the onboarding process go? And I basically take it from a single very generic question to whatever they want to talk about. And at regular intervals, I check if I'm covering most parts of the model. But the goal for me is to really have a 3-hour conversation, and ideally in this conversation speak to a lot of all of the different people in the same meeting. And it tends to work quite well. If I've been working with larger organizations, I do have to spend a lot of time upfront familiarizing myself with their architecture, especially with their acronyms. So if you have these large corporations, they have their own language between them, and I often really have to spend some time using the right acronyms and names of documents in order to elicit the right responses. But for a small to medium-sized organization, normally I finish in like 6 hours and have a really good idea of what they got going on and of their maturity. If I don't have everyone in the same meeting room, or if it's a really complex organization, it's gravitates towards another additional meeting. But that's the approach here. On remote versus in person, I actually do prefer remote. I don't know. I still love the in-person interaction, but I'm quite used to doing remote meetings now. I find it really handy to have the recording and transcript later. So if I'm building a report, I'm able to refer to what was said. And I often take another person with me to do notes, or indeed to double check if I didn't miss anything. So that's the basic approach.
Thanks, Maxim. Rob, do you have like a third secret option, or is it somewhere in between?
Yeah, I have a couple of things. By the way, this is all very inspiring to hear. Thank you, guys. We don't record. My experience is that it changes the dynamics. I mean, it's weird, right? Because people are saying things and we can write them down. It's the same thing, but it's experienced differently. And I think you cannot record in secret. I think it's even illegal in some situations. So we don't do that. So we have a note taker with typically expertise in the area, because then you can bounce back and forth. Sometimes it takes some time, to think things through, and then the other can jump in. So you can also distribute some of that that thinking. Typically, we have a primary note taker, but the other person also takes notes. You have insights during the session that probably the other person doesn't have. So you both need to have a pen and a paper, not a laptop. Why not? You can hear typing, and in a session you can see typing, which comes across as more distant, right? Because that screen is in between you. So I prefer to use pen and paper, but maybe that's a personal thing. Regarding the constellation of sessions, it indeed depends. Some organizations have very different domains and realms, sometimes even different domains with governance. So you need to speak to multiple people, how things are governed. Mostly design, implementation, and verification are integrated. Teams are very, T-shaped. But for example, in embedded, you're dealing with teams that are focusing on design. So there it's different. Normally, when we do an assessment, we try to get a picture of this. So we need first to speak to people who know the organization, and then we do an estimate how many interviews we need for each domain on average. We create sort of a budget for sessions. But as we go along, we learn that that person really didn't know what he was talking about. We need another interview. So you need some slack in the number of interviews that you're allowed to do within the budget. And depending on how sensitive things are, for example, if you know that the organization has really low maturity and there's a high shame factor, also depends on the geography, of course. It can be helpful to do one-on-ones, so for people to really open up. But if that's not the matter, you can put larger groups together and get more out of that. So yeah, like Brian said, and like also Maxime indicated, it depends on the context very much.
Thank you. Just before we go to Maxime's question or comment, like more or less general rule. So Brian has 5 sessions of 60 to 90 minutes. Maxime has 2 to 3 sessions of 2 to 3 hours. Sessions like interviews. Rob, what would you say, like typical median?
And sometimes for an organization, you just need one interview for governance and one for operations. But if they have, let's say they have 3 clusters of teams that work in a very similar way, then you need to cover, the technical stuff. And then typically, if you have the right person, you can do a one-on-one and be finished in 2 hours. It is possible. But do allow for a small break halfway, because I agree with Brian. And this is, I guess, Maxime, also your experience. At some point, people start to wear out a little bit, or they need a bio break. So a little break is good, I think.
Yeah, let it be
Okay.
clear from
I'm not
these 3-hour
Yeah.
meetings. Sorry, there is a break, but I like to dive deep in a topic myself and then just stay there for quite a while and building off all of the information I'm getting. So a 3-hour session for me is a continuous proceeding inside and then being able to ask better questions with every moment. What I also want to mention is, Rob, because you mentioned you don't record. So I do take notes on not on paper, but on like an e-ink tablet. Same reason that you mentioned, it just typing distracts for a lot of people. But most of these sessions, we really hammer it down that this is not an audit. Like, we're doing this SAMM session for you. It is for you to improve. If you lie to me, if you tell me, if you bullshit, then well, we're just going to deliver your report that you're not going to have much use of. So if you want, it's basically like, if you want to learn, be honest. And I really try to cultivate this atmosphere of openness and in my experience, maybe in the beginning, people are reluctant to answer, but my trick is basically to really dive into their context, into their world, and as I mentioned, use the right terms, really try to understand how they work, what their pains are, and after a while, I really do tend to get a lot of very good answers with this methodology.
Thank
If
you,
I may-
Maxime.
if I-
That brings me.
If
Yeah,
I may
go on.
respond, yes, you're describing perhaps the most important part of the interviewing skills, to create rapport, to set the stage for openness. And it's hard to describe how you do this. Sometimes it's in your nonverbals, it's in, letting people speak, it's showing credibility, right? People have a hard time explaining how they work when they fear that it's going to be misinterpreted because you don't know what you're talking about. So you have to do a little bit of bragging at the beginning, or just go deep, just to show that you will not misinterpret what they're saying, that you have development experience, that you recognize things. And it's, for example, let's take a tiny detail. If somebody mentions something really sensitive, like they take a pause and you know what, and then they say it, and if you then do like this and you go down to your notebook, it's they will feel, okay, he's snitching on us. So even sort of hiding the fact that you're writing down this thing, maybe if somebody says really sensitive, you soon write it down and keep it in your mind and write it down later. It's the little things like that, and like you described, Maxime, creating that stage of honesty. If you feel that that the rapport, that the trust is there, I think you can record. You can set the stage for recording. Mostly, I'm too sort of I find it too riskful in the situations where I am.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Which brings me to that's a nice switch of topics, because that was sort of my next question. This is not an audit, and your life doesn't really depend on it. That's typically the message that each SAMM assessment start with, at least in my experience, and I see nobody disagrees there. My question is, where do you strike the balance between being a friend who's going to teach them, but also making sure that they don't exaggerate / lie, whether consciously or subconsciously, because eventually you're getting evaluated at the end of the day. It's an assessment. It's not a webinar. So what would be the other tips and tricks? Well, Rob already mentioned one. But I would really love to hear more tactics of how do you set the stage. Even if you have trust, they might still sort of exaggerate a little bit, not too much. But where do you push? How do you get to the detail, to the bottom of things? And is that really, really important if they get half a score more or less? So it's a long question, I know, but Whatever your answer is good, because my question is probably going to be, I can still also rephrase my question when I'm building the final recording. Brian, I would like to start with you.
So for me, as Rob mentioned, and we've talked about, trust is paramount. So when I go in there, it is very much, this is for your benefit. This is for you to tell a story. There are no names associated with anything we record. You know, this is just in general. Hey, somebody mentioned this. This is what's working. This is what's not. Trying to, because especially the more trust you build, the more honest they're going to be likely to be.
Yep.
Now, you have to deal with interesting things too, where depending on who you're talking to, what part of the world they're from, what culture they have, some cultures are more prone to exaggerate because that's normal for their culture. It's saving face or whatever is going on in their area. And so you have to be cognizant of this and then be careful about how you ask questions, how you pry, how you dig, so that you can gently work around and figure out, is what I'm hearing accurate? And is there other ways to verify it? So it's kind of like doing a survey where you ask the same question in two slightly different ways, and you're trying to verify whether that first answer is really the answer. And you have to, it's not necessarily a game, but it's kind of like a game. You have to work through it. And so that's part of the reason, and I'm pretty sure we all do this. We don't do assessments by just asking the questions in the same questionnaire. The questionnaire has questions that need to be scored, yes, but the value that a third party brings is that interpretation and the ability to ferret out what is actually happening, not what we would want to happen, not what we think other people want to happen, but what is actually going on. And so that trust is huge. Being able to do that, to try and make sure that you can speak openly without being punished. And that's one of the harder things. And but to be honest, when I go back to third-party assessments, I've found people far more willing to trust a third-party consultant that is completely neutral than they are to trust even an internal representative somewhere. Because I don't have, like, one, I don't really have a reason to badmouth anybody. That doesn't do me any good. So for them, it's less likely to happen. But I don't know. I mean, for me, that trust is a lot. Building that rapport, like Rob mentioned, if you can, even if there's a few minutes of light talk beforehand to establish common grounds of things that people like or don't like, if you can respond to them talking about something and say, I've experienced this before, or you have your own anecdote or your own story about where you've encountered that helps them be more comfortable with understanding that they're talking to another human and one that can empathize with what they're dealing with. And that's huge.
So small talk is key. I would like to switch to Rob because I know Rob also is part of several ISO working groups. Rob, correct me if I'm wrong. And I know like jokes are really forbidden there. Can you still do small talk without jokes, Rob? And you can, by the way, you can also answer the previous question in combination with this one.
Yeah, funny. So while Brian was explaining this, I thought of that. I thought of the fact that in very international settings, you need to be careful with humor, and I've learned that the hard way. So that requires some tactful experience with different cultures. ISO is extreme because you're sitting with people from all over the world in one room. But I would behave differently in an interview setting with a team in Indonesia or a team in China or a team in Germany. It requires some cultural flexibility, and sometimes it's It's unknown ground, and then you need to be careful, and maybe tone down a little bit on the humor. But of course, be cautious, be friendly, find common ground, connect, be respectful, be humble. You need help
Yeah.
to gain insight. You're not,
Yeah.
the big guru that's coming in. And at the same time, you want to be authentic. So good luck with that. It's 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 pretty hard, and there are all kinds of sort of tricks to get to the truth. I'm not referring to medieval torture or waterboarding, although I've never tried it with teams. But what really helps is just for the team to know that you have access to artifacts, that you can look up in their version history, that you have access to their wiki. And what I always do is in a session, once they claim something, I say, show me. Take me to your Confluence, share your screen, show me where those guidelines are, or those reports of the threat modeling. Show me, don't tell me. And when they know you have access to artifacts, that's sort of a bit of an audit effect, but they'll be more truthful. It's also in asking clever questions, in the sense that you don't want to suggest what the wrong answer is in your question.
Yep.
So if people are not allowed to use internet on a factory floor, for example, and you want to find out, you're not going to ask, do you use internet on the factory floor? Because they will be saying, no. You're going to ask, so what browser do you use when you when you go to the internet on the factory floor? And then you'll know the answer. It's a bit of a trick, but for sensitive things, you can apply this. And last but not least, I guess, asking how things went recently, instead of how do things normally go, because then will people think, okay, yeah, what are our instructions, or what is our policy? That's not the question. The question is, what did you do last time when you found a vulnerability? Just let them storytell more, which brings me to my final thing, which is make it into a conversation, right? I mean, we've all have experience with this during these interviews, and notice that when you make it a conversation that doesn't follow the exact topics that you prepared in advance, but you go from A to B to C, just what they want to talk about, go with them. It makes it a conversation. It's quite challenging intellectually, because in your mind, you and your colleague need to sort of to tick off the boxes, the topics that were not discussed and the topic that were discussed, so you don't miss anything. But let it flow, let people speak, create silence, right? If people answer, just don't say anything, just sit there, and they will add things automatically. Those are some of the tricks up the sleeves of our job as assessors.
Thanks, Rob. Maxim, what are your tricks
I think a lot of them already
and best
mentioned here.
practices?
I think a lot of them are already mentioned. One thing I haven't heard from the others is what I often do is, and this might be part of building rapport, as Rob mentioned, but I don't try to treat it like this synthetic thing. I ask open-ended questions, and I often explain my rationale. So, hey, this is what I'm looking for. This is what the process that I'm looking for. I know you're doing something slightly different, but I sketch the context of what I'm looking for and let them basically fill in the blanks. For example, on threat modeling, if a company doesn't do proper threat modeling, but they do architecture design review and they do some people do security analysis, I have like the ideal process in my head, and I'll explain them like, okay, I've seen this done like so and so and so. Is there something similar that you're doing? And I lead it on. So I lead them on basically like, hey, this is what I'm looking for. And by basically getting them on my train of thought, there's often that we're solving the problem together instead of me trying to like poke or like pull stuff from their heads. As Rob mentioned, the conversation, like having this conversation, for me, it's really just I really do enjoy this. It's not really a trick. I'm always interested in how people work, and I like talking to people, but pitfall of that, is something I had to learn, is like to cut off tangents at a certain point. So that is also an important thing. Still keep control of the conversation and guide it as you go. And over time, I've become a little bit better in guiding the conversation and keeping it more or less on track while still feeling natural. And I have to think. I think all the rest of the, let's say, the tricks were mentioned. So
Okay.
Well, I think
Thanks, guys.
think
I would like to.
Maxim. Sorry, Aram. I didn't want
no,
to
go
miss
ahead.
this point. I think Maxim brought up an important point there, and that was the terminology. So one of the things, like if you ask them, hey, do you have a threat modeling process? And they are not familiar with that term, or they're
Yeah.
like, yeah, we have no process named threat modeling. If you have awareness of this, where you're like, okay, do you have something that deals, like, do you look at the architecture? Do you look at the design? Do you evaluate risks? You know, is there something that keeps you up at night related to how this goes? And they're like, oh, yeah, well, we don't do threat modeling, but we do this. And they start to describe essentially the essence of threat modeling. They just don't call it that. And that's one of the immense values, I think, that you can bring as an assessor, is being able to find the work that they're doing that they should get credit for, but they don't realize they should get credit for. And that kind of ties back to self-assessments. I've seen self-assessments go both directions. I've seen people seriously underscore themselves because they're not familiar with the terminology. So they're like, I've never heard of this, we must not do it. And then I've seen them overscore because of just pressures and competition. But I think terminology is a huge part of that. Just trying to help get past that terminology.
Yeah. What about asking them to prepare? Do you ask the people you're going to assess to prepare something in advance? Like, do they need perhaps to follow the SAMM fundamentals training? Is there any requirement, or is the good idea even to ask them to prepare in advance, or you just go in there, have a conversation, and if necessary, you provide explanation of what each activity or certain activity means, and how is it structured in a SAMM model, or what the best practices are? Anyone can jump in.
Yeah. Well, I already mentioned, I think, I start my sessions, or at least a single SAM assessment, I do start with a little bit of training. Once we have done an initial SAM assessment, we're working a roadmap, or with companies that have a little bit, or organizations that have already, let's say, some established maturity, then I do point them to the SAM fundamentals course for the security champions, or for the key stakeholders of the process. And that's really when they are going to take ownership of the process themselves. Then they benefit very much from like knowing all of the model. But in general, I just give them enough basic to know what the scope is, know what we're talking about, and go further. But I'm always open to questions. So again, we're having this conversation. So sometimes questions flow my way, and I give some explanations on the let's say the details of how it's being done, and I try to keep it at that. So there's no prerequisites on training. What I do ask upfront is like documentation, and as mentioned, I think before, some architecture documentation, acronyms if they have them, organigram, organizational structure, stuff that helps me orient.
Gotcha. Rob?
Yeah, the funny thing is when you, I wonder what your experience is with this, Maxime. When you request documentation in advance and then you do an interview, people are often agitated if you're asking things that were in the documentation. So this is something I've learned sort of important to manage. If people send things in advance, mention that you use this as a reference, not that you'll study everything and ask the remaining things. But it's good to ask things. Okay.
For me, I do make it clear that, hey, for me, just to be able to ask the right questions and explain it like this, if I go unprepared in an assessment of your team, and your team, in essence, is building embedded devices, but I go with, let's say, the cloud scope, we're going to start off on the wrong foot. And it will take me a while to reorient and understand, like, oh, this is what you're actually doing. if you provide me upfront with the architecture documentation and perhaps a little bit more contextual info, I'm able to speak your language, and everyone can go home earlier. That's basically the incentive.
Yeah.
And I do mention them that I'm not going to like hold them. Any documentation is fine, whatever they send me. I'm not asking for evidences.
I see. So you're making clear that you're using the documentation for orientation, right?
Correct.
Yeah. The thing is that in order to prepare clients, we don't ask them to do any training. We also never send them the exact questions or refer them to the sheet, for example. Neither do we tell them beforehand that we'll be using SAMM, because they can look up the sheet. It's not a secret, but you get better answers if you surprise people. Because what can happen, and we've seen this, if you send all the questions in advance, they're going to talk about it in the team, and people in the team are going to influence the answers. The person responsible for the threat modeling is going to say, no, we definitely do this. Answer yes here. It's creating noise. And that noise is less if you surprise people with the actual questions, but you want to orient. So you want to get some documentation beforehand, preferably, and you want to have the right people at the table, which means that it's necessary to send them a list of topics that you're going to talk about, at least. Not the questions, but the topics. So we want somebody who can tell us about these things, and then surprise them with the actual questions.
Yeah, we don't have much time, and now I realize that 1 hour is not even close.
Indeed.
But that's okay. I need to ask absolutely 2 more questions, and I'm going to ask these questions now. So, well, one of them is mainly to Rob, because I know, Rob, you're involved with a lot with AI, but I will ask the question now, but you can answer in a little bit. Well, in 2 minutes or something. AI and SAMM assessments, do they go together? Is there anything that we can use from large language models? Any experiences there? But before we go there, I want to ask the questions we discussed so far, best practices in SAMM assessments. We were always assuming that the party you are assessing is actually going to work with you because it's in their best interest. That is not really always the case when it comes to mergers and acquisitions, because you might be mandated by your friend firm, let's say, who wants to figure out if a company they want to acquire has sufficiently enough security. So the question is, what would be the tips and tricks be if you're assessing a company who is probably wants to cook things to make it look way better than it actually is, because that is the reality probably when you're assessing a company in merger acquisitions. We have 3 minutes left, more or less. So quick tips are welcome.
Yeah.
Yes, Rob.
Waterboarding, of course. No, I would go. I would refer to the tips that are normally used to get to the truth.
Okay.
And in this situation, typically ask a lot of artifacts. Let them, show the actual threat models, not the. Don't ask them for the policy documents. Ask them for the results of their work to verify what they're saying.
Okay.
Yeah, the trust goes both ways. So the more hostile they want to be, the more audit-like you have to be. You have to balance that.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you, Brian. Maxime, anything to add?
No, I think as Rob mentioned, and it's make it an audit. Focus on the evidences, focus on digging deeper. And as Brian mentioned, trust goes both ways. I might start off like on the very friendly, but then as if I notice that I'm being bullshitted, I'll harden up.
So SAMM audit does exist as a concept in that.
I hate it.
Just rare. It's not rare
in that context.
Yeah.
All right. Last question. This everyone can answer, by the way. Is there anything large language models and AI can do for essentially making SAMM assessments easier? Like, I don't know, figure out something in a database of existing documents and say, probably you have a score of 2.3. I'm making this stuff up.
There's one use case that for which AI can really add benefit, at least, and we've experimented. We applied a large language model to interpreting the results from a SAMM assessment and come up with recommendations while injecting the context of the SAMM model. And it's amazing what comes out of it. It really is. I mean, it will not replace us. And when you use the output of that, you need to be super careful because it will contain hallucinations. But I mean, I'm doing this work for a long time. But even I found that some of the, the phrasings and the suggestions from the AI were, really inspiring and good to use. So it's a great input to your work as a consultant in creating a report over the conclusions of your work. It can support there. The danger is that you get lazy and you need to finish your day and you send out the results to the client. Don't do that.
Thanks, Rob. We're out of time, but I definitely now know what the next podcast is going to be about. SAMM and large language models. Thanks, guys, very, very much. I can't say how much I appreciate this. I'm pretty sure that people will really like to listen to this. And I'm hopeful that you also liked it, the experiences of the others. Thanks, and see you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.
This was great.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.